50 years ago today, which explains some current events, was the start of the Yom Kippur War, which was between Israel and the Arab coalition of Egypt and Syria. Many people think that the closest the world came to a nuclear war was with the 1962 missile crisis with JFK, and it was very close. But there was another nuclear incident about a decade after that in 1973 with the USA and Soviet Union, when they had some heated exchanges during the Yom Kippur War. On October 6, 1973, the Arab coalition launched a surprise attack on Israel during the first day of the Jewish holiday Yom Kippur. So that's why a lot of people refer to it as the Yom Kippur War. And the Arab coalition did this in response to Israel's actions a few years prior during what's known as the Six-Day War. Israel, previously just right here, captured all of these key territories from the Arab countries. And even though there was a few years of negotiation, Israel refused to give them back. So during the Yom Kippur War, Egypt, right here, attacked Israel through the Suez Canal. And Syria, up here, attacked Israel through the Golan Heights. What these two countries were doing were just reclaiming the area that was stolen from them years prior. This was a total shock to Israel. No one, United States included, really saw this coming on that day. So Egypt and Syria definitely had the upper hands in the war and were winning. Israeli forces were depleting, they had little strategic plan, and the United States, their main ally, was very hesitant on sending aid. And it's very important to mention that during this time, the Soviet Union, allies of Egypt and Syria, were sending those countries plenty of aid. But on October 9th, only 3 days after the war broke out, a ceasefire was called. And the Soviet Union reached out twice to the United States, asking if they would be interested in a joint operation to persuade peace in the Middle East. Remember that a lot of the fighting is happening up here in Golan Heights. On October 11th, only 2 days after the peace, Israeli forces are marching towards Golan Heights and they are headed towards Damascus. This action single-handedly ends the peace during the ceasefire. They are headed towards Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. Now, because the Soviet Union and Syria were allies during the Cold War, the Soviets had a cultural center in Damascus. The Israeli forces were only 12 miles away from Damascus. As Nixon said when he found out the news, that's just across the desert, isn't it? The Israeli forces marching towards Damascus prompted the Soviet Union to send a third and final message to the US, that the Soviet Union was going to act unilaterally in the Middle East now, aka they were going to drop a nuke. And as all of this information is coming into the White House, Nixon is drunk out of his mind. He is reading nothing. He is responding to nothing. All while the US intelligence is receiving intel that the Soviet Union is well on their way to sending nuke heads for Egyptians to use. Two things need to happen almost immediately for these nukes to not go off. One, someone, somewhere, has to tell the Israeli forces to stop marching towards Damascus. If IDF boots hit Damascus, the nukes are going to go off. Two, if the US does not respond to these Soviet messages, the nukes are going to be dropped. Both of these things are incredibly reliant upon Nixon sobering up and sending a message. Until, at the quite literally 11th hour, a group of 5 men led by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger started responding and acting out accordance with the U.S. government. These 5 men were the U.S. government. It was mainly the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the CIA director. They raised the United States nuclear alert to DEFCON 3, which is the highest level that you can go short of actually sending a nuke. This was to alert the Soviets that retaliation would happen if they dropped a nuke on Israel. And then these men a day later launched Operation Nickelgrass, which was all about deploying supplies and weapons for the Israeli forces, to show the Soviet Union that the US essentially is taking measures to safeguard Israel and sort of keeping them under watch to not further escalate. Now, with all these measures falling into place, Israel was able to get the upper hand again. They pushed back the Arab coalition, regained the Suez Canal and the Golan Heights, and essentially won the Yom Kippur War. A less severe outcome of this was the United States passing the War Powers Act of 1973, which basically says that the US president or just a small group of people cannot take war actions or determine the nation's course of war without having congressional approval first. Congress didn't like it. This resulted in the boundary lines and the peace attempts that we now, 50 years later, that we are still dealing with today. That's what happened today. 50 years ago, there was a surprise attack on Israel. Today, there was a surprise attack on Israel. History tends to repeat itself.